One of the things that makes my life more interesting is I get to, for the speaker series, partner with various agencies on campus, and one of the ones that's been very good to us has been Joel Fisher with the Energy Institute. So today's speaker is one of two this quarter that Joel has brought to us, which is great. So basically I'm mining other people's Rolodexes beyond my own, so that broadens your, who you get to see and hear. So I'm going to let Joel introduce it. Request that you silence your cell phones and direct attention to Joel, and then Chris.
Thanks, Stefan. So, yeah, a couple times a quarter at the Institute for Energy Studies, we like to kind of infiltrate the speaker series and invite speakers to talk about topics having to do with clean energy, and that, of course, has to do with the environment as well, for obvious reasons. The Institute for Energy Studies, in case you don't know, is a multi-college collaboration between the Huxley College, the College of Business and Economics, and the College of Science and Technology. We have majors and minors and tracks in different majors. And a couple dozen courses, and if you want to know more, you can look at our website or come talk to me.
Oh, good.
Our speaker today is Greacen, who is going to talk about minigrid development in Southeast Asia. And Chris is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley Energy and Resources Group with a PhD from that program, which is probably the most prestigious and probably the most competitive graduate program in our field. So those of the energy tribe who aspire to go to grad school, that's a high bar. More recently, Chris has been working really all over the world, but mostly in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa and other areas, working on the development of renewable energy-powered mini-grids, which are becoming ever more cost-effective and ever more a part of really mainstream development strategies, although still seen as a challenge in many places to the conventional power industry. But he works as a consultant to the World Bank, to other multilateral banks and agencies, and to the host governments and power companies as well. And I'll turn it over to Chris Greacen. Thanks for coming, Chris. And he has a zero net energy house in a mostly zero net energy community on Lopez Island. So we'll come over for a beer one day.
Yeah, you're all welcome to come and visit.
How about the lights? Okay, there we go.
Great. Wow. Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I was especially excited to kind of hear about this Energy Institute here at Western. Because when I was an undergraduate student years and years ago, something like this just didn't exist. And it's energy issues are really important for society, and it's really important to look at them not just as an engineering topic or not just as a business topic, but look at them from all different kinds of perspectives, from anthropological and sociological and business and environment and engineering. And learning about new programs, especially in my backyard, that are doing this are really wonderful. I was thinking, in light of the momentous occasion tomorrow with Trump's inauguration, maybe folks are here to learn about an up-and-coming democracy with some positive results. It's a little off color, sorry. Or maybe you're interested in mini-grids, which can help provide electricity in the event that the apocalypse happens or something. I'm going to talk about mini-grids in Myanmar specifically. I've had the good fortune to be working there in the past couple of years. And I guess before I get into the mini-grids, which are kind of a thin slice of it, I just want to mention that it's a lot of these decisions about the way that rural electrification happens in Myanmar or in other countries is kind of against a backdrop of bigger questions about the way that power sector planning and energy development in general will go. And I'm happy to kind of field some questions about that or discuss later after the slides. But in Myanmar, Myanmar was really closed to the rest of the world for about 50 years under a military dictatorship. And only recently is kind of stepped out of that with democratic elections, and most recently with the election of Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy. There's a lot of different voices in Myanmar about how to address their energy situation. A lot of the energy infrastructure hasn't really changed in the past 50 years, and so there's a lot of catching up that needs to happen. But the future of what that's going to look like is really kind of a blank slate, and that's what makes it really exciting to work there. And one voice or one set of voices wants to see tens of thousands of megawatts of large hydropower projects built, some to power Myanmar, but also to export power to nearby Thailand and China and India. And other voices are kind of pushing for more of a smallest beautiful, decentralized, more kind of democratic pathway. So that's all some context. So I'm going to talk about mini-grids and give some examples of mini-grids, especially in Myanmar, and then talk about some of the interesting technology drivers that are making making mini-grids really exciting these days. I'm then going to shift back and look at Myanmar's National Electrification Program, which is a program for rural electrification, for electrifying the whole country. And then I'll finish up with some challenges about doing mini-grids as an electrification option in Myanmar, and just touch on financing, on technology, and then a little bit more heavily on the regulatory framework, kind of the rules of the game, which are in some sense important to get in place before you can address some of the others. So what is a mini-grid anyway? For the work that I do, mini-grids are electric networks that distribute electricity to one or several villages. Generally, we're talking about less than 10,000 households, and generally include some kind of local generation. It might be diesel, it might be renewable energy. And this definition of mini-grids is actually kind of different than the definition that you might see in America or Europe. And so there's some confusion of over the terminology that I run into a lot. In America and Europe, it seems, and Joel, maybe you can speak to this more because it's kind of outside of my field of expertise, but it seems that mini-grids also seem to mean local generation, but for super high reliability. For example, for data centers and hospitals and industry that you really can't afford to shut down. So in America, where there's already 99.9% reliability for the utility, these industrial customers will pay a premium for 99.99999% reliability. That's not really what we're talking about in this context. It's more how to electrify households in rural areas. So let me touch on some drivers. One big one is that the cost of renewable energy has been going down, especially solar panels. And this data is as of 2013. It's even dropped a bit since then, but solar panels are now below 50 cents a watt. It used to be kind of the magic number was $1 a watt. And in the meanwhile, diesel prices have been volatile and generally rising. Another interesting driver is the ubiquity of cell phone signals all over the world in rural areas. And what this allows is online monitoring of these remote mini-grids in villages to be able to notice how they're doing and to catch problems when they're still small and before they cascade and become big problems. The ubiquity of cell phones, and this has really been the case just in the past few years in Myanmar. Just 5 years ago, a SIM card in Myanmar was $2,000 on the black market. Now it's $1.50. And when you go even in remote villages, everyone, it seems, has a smartphone. So people are getting connected through smartphones, and they need a small amount of electricity to keep those things charged. So there's an interesting market just in charging cell phones that's emerging. And then this is less the case in Myanmar, but coming to Myanmar soon, and hugely the case in Africa, the existence of mobile money as a as a payment mechanism. So where cash is kind of unwieldy and there aren't a lot of rural banks, people use cell phones to pay for everything. And to transfer money, to pay for parking tickets and traffic tickets, and also to pay for electricity bills. And this helps out because it really lowers the transaction costs involved in sending someone out to lots of remote households to collect payments, and 3/4 of the time somebody might not be there because they're out in the field or whatever. So this makes that automatic. Another big exciting change has been vast improvements in energy efficiency, particularly for lighting. This is an image of an LED. These light-emitting diodes, LEDs, are now you see them everywhere on the taillights of cars and on parking lights and stuff. And they are widely found in rural areas as well, and are much more efficient than old-fashioned incandescent lights, and very robust. So because the amount of electricity needed to perform basic things like lighting has gone down so much, smaller renewable energy mini-grids can provide a lot more energy service for the same amount of energy. Let me touch on some examples of mini-grids, especially in Myanmar, as we find them now. There's a lot of these. Simple diesel engine-powered generators. The Myanmar government estimated at one point that there was around 13,000 of these electrifying villages. They're often these Chinese generators, typically below 20 kilowatts, and will be turned on in the evening from maybe 7 till 10 or so. And electricity is distributed over wires, and the quality of those distribution systems really varies hugely. On the left-hand side, this is perhaps more typical funky, undersized wires on wooden poles that rot quickly with really terrible splices that would have high losses. Sometimes people even use galvanized wire, galvanized steel. So for the electrical engineers in here, you can imagine why that wouldn't be a great idea. And then on the right is a more recent mini-grid with concrete poles and properly sized conductors. And mini-grids built with poles like this are grid ready in the sense that when the grid arrives, they're able to interconnect and be part of that national network. And this is an issue I'll touch upon a little bit more. Here's some examples of other types of generation sources for mini-grids in Myanmar. These are pictures of biomass gasifiers made by a local manufacturing company in Myanmar. It's a little hard to tell what's going on in the images, but basically these are truck engines or old boat engines, diesel engines. And these cylinders are used to take biomass fuel, rice husk or wood chips, and they burn it in an oxygen-poor environment to create mostly carbon monoxide. And the carbon monoxide then can be cleaned up a bit and then piped into these diesel engines where it combusts further to form carbon monoxide and water. Here's one of the larger hydropower mini-grids in Myanmar. This is a 3 megawatt project in Shan State in the eastern part of the country, using large Chinese hydropower generators. And this is on the large side of mini-grids powering a city, an isolated town or city in the country. Let's see. Here's a much smaller and more typical micro hydropower project in Myanmar. I've really been impressed with the civil engineering skills of these folks who have been, like I mentioned earlier, isolated from the rest of the world for 50 years and have built these things often, just paging through engineering textbooks from the 1960s and kind of figuring stuff out by themselves. This is a 20 kilowatt micro hydro project that electrified a village of about 150 households. Here's another micro hydro project, again using locally manufactured equipment. And this is a more recent mini-grid solar mini-grid with a grid-ready distribution system and fancy electronic prepay meters and so forth. And this particular one was built under an ADB, Asian Development Bank pilot project, and just recently commissioned. This is some data from the Myanmar government. Perhaps the most useful summary figures are just these ones down on the bottom, showing how many of these mini-grids of different types are believed to already exist out in rural Myanmar. This estimate of 2,400 is for diesels that power at least 70% of the households. I mentioned a figure earlier of 13,000. That's kind of smaller mini-grids that might power just small portions of villages. Not many solar mini-grids, just 150 or so. A surprising amount of micro-hydro projects, 1,200, and then a lot of 400 or so biomass gasifier projects. But there's still, out of the 64,000 villages that are in Myanmar, most of them, 43,000 or so, remain unelectrified. So there's a real blank slate here, and an interesting opportunity to figure out how to provide basic electricity services. So now I'm going to turn to the National Electrification Program in Myanmar, which is a program for rural electrification. This map shows the country of Myanmar, and the white area in the middle is the area that has grid electricity at this point. In terms of villages, the electrification rate is about 33%. And so far, about 190,000 connections a year have been installed, but they've set a target, the Myanmar government set a target of universal electrification by the year 2030. And in order to meet that target, they're going to have to ramp up how many households they're electrifying by quite a bit, by more than twofold. This is a geospatial master plan that was developed for rural electrification in the country. And it's estimated to be a pretty big project, about $6 billion to electrify the whole country. It's been divided into 5 different phases where the villages that are closest to the existing system of medium voltage lines and electricity lines are electrified first, and then those that are further out get electrified later. And the ones that are in the phases 4 and 5 are also eligible for what they're calling pre-electrification, which is solar home systems or these mini-grids. The idea is it'll take 15 years or 20 years to get to these villages. And so in the meantime, solar home systems and mini-grids provide basic electricity and then perhaps can integrate with the grid later. So these pre-electrification villages are the ones that are shown in the darker purple. It's a little bit hard to distinguish it from the lighter blue. The World Bank has been working with the Myanmar government to accomplish rural electrification, and they started with a $400 million super low interest loan. I think it was 0.25% with a 40-year tenor. And most of that money is going for conventional grid expansion, $300 million of it. But 80 million of it is going for off-grid, which is a mixture of solar home systems and mini-grids. And that's done through this Department of Rural Development that I work with quite a bit. Of the $80 million, about 70 million, or about 7 million is allocated for mini-grids. So villages that have less than 50 households are typically slated for solar home systems. And the the Myanmar government recently did a large procurement they do about 200,000 solar home systems a year. And then minigrids are reserved for villages that have more than 50 households or so. Typically, we're talking about solar electricity or solar diesel hybrids or micro hydropower. They'll provide more electricity typically than you'd get from a solar home system, and therefore can provide electricity not just for lighting and cell phones, but also for fans and small fridges, and also for what we call productive use loads, like grain milling and sawing of wood and basic industry. The cost of these are more than solar home systems, typically $400 to $1,400 a household. This was a comparison of the costs of electrification technologies that I put together that was comparing minigrids and grid extension. And the size of the circle is the amount of electricity that's assumed to be consumed by each household. And how far it is on this x-axis is the initial cost, how much it costs to make that connection to the household. And then on the y-axis is the cost in dollars per kilowatt hour. And what you can kind of see is if you're using a lot of electricity, the cost per kilowatt hour for grids are going to be pretty cheap. But if you're interested in smaller amounts of electricity, mini grids and the solar home systems have a lot lower initial costs, even if the cost per kilowatt hour is going to be higher. So it's an interesting balance between initial costs versus the cost of energy in the long run. Some challenges that we've been seeing in trying to help encourage the implementation of these off-grid technologies, and mini-grids in particular in Myanmar, include technology and financing and the regulatory framework. And I'll just touch on the technology and financing briefly here. As you could kind of see from the pictures I was showing, one issue with these existing mini-grids is that the generators that are used are inefficient, they're old, they're kind of poorly engineered. There's generally little or no frequency or voltage regulation, so when people plug up appliances into them, high voltages or low voltages can cause them to burn out, can cause the appliances to burn out. Distribution networks are often inadequate with funky wooden poles that rot, with poor splices and inadequately sized wires. And often there's no metering, so it's just payment for the electricity is just on the basis of how many light bulbs you have in your house. Or if you have a TV and light bulbs, then you pay a different rate. And that, on the one hand, doesn't really provide any encouragement for people to conserve electricity, and is also kind of prone to cheating. It's easy to install more than you said you had. Financing has been a real challenge with mini-grids and many other things in Myanmar. The financial institutions that we kind of take for granted here in America or in Europe just don't exist. Where loans are available through local loan sharks, they're at very high interest rates, 40% per year, typical. And a 1-year loan tenor, which means you have to pay back the entire principal in 1 year. And there's just impossible terms to do a village electrification project with those kind of financial terms. There's also very limited equity investors, people that are willing to step up and put their own money on the table to build these projects with the hope of getting a return. And then finally, there's really no regulatory framework for mini-grids in Myanmar. Part of the issue is that there's no regulator. All of electricity development that's happened in the past 40 years has been done by one ministry and this ministry has been kind of the policeman and has been the referee and the team. And it's done the generation and the transmission and the distribution. As you can imagine, if you have the referee also being the team, you can end up with situations that aren't optimal. So let me focus a bit on the policies and regulation side, because that's what I work on a lot at the bank with regard to minigrids and rural electrification. As I mentioned, the support program for off-grid electricity has been this $80 million portion of the World Bank loan, and then that's complemented by a similar amount of money from the Myanmar government. Most of that money has been going for procuring solar home systems, and then about $7 million goes for mini-grids over a period of 5 years. So far, in this fiscal year, the government started out offering a 60% subsidy, so they pay 60% of the capital cost of a mini-grid. Villages were expected to come up with 20%, and then the developer would come up with another 20%, and they'd get paid back over time through selling the electricity, through the prepaid electricity. The Myanmar government decided that it wasn't so comfortable with the idea of providing subsidies for systems that were owned by developers, and so they're shifting to a model where there's 80% subsidy provided by the government, 20% by community, and then it would be community owned. And the first call for proposals for about 20 mini-grids went out in November. One of the things that we've noticed in talking with developers of these mini-grids is that they're often reluctant to build mini-grids for a variety of reasons. One of them is that they're concerned that the grid may arrive faster than they think it is. So often governments and development agencies like the World Bank and so forth will pay for these grand geospatial plans like the one that I showed you earlier. And then what happens is that local politics kind of gets in the way. Somebody that's running for parliament says, I promise I will give you electricity in 3 years rather than 5 years, and if you elect me. And then when he gets elected, then there's a lot of pressure for this guy to deliver. And so he tries to kind of use some political pressure to tweak the system so that that particular village where his constituents live will get electricity faster. And that kind of disruptions to electricity planning can cause a real headache to mini-grid developers who have the expectation of building a mini-grid and selling electricity over the course of 10 years or so to get back their return on investment. So that's been a big issue. Another is an issue that competitors might steal sites. And this is particularly an issue for microhydro. So microhydropower is, as you can imagine, works best where you have a lot of water that falls down a waterfall, and waterfalls are kind of limited. And so if one developer does a bunch of engineering work to conceptualize a design for an installation in a particular area, and then submits those to the government to kind of get that program in the queue, they're concerned that somebody else will steal that site and somehow slip ahead of them in the queue, and then they won't be able to build it. There's also lack of clarity about whether cost-reflective tariffs can be charged. So it's unclear how much you can charge for the electricity that you're selling. In Myanmar, for the electricity that's sold on the national grid, there's a uniform tariff. So a tariff that's the same for the whole country for customers of a certain class. And it's really low. It's about 3 cents a kilowatt hour for a typical household. And comparing that to electricity, even here in the Pacific Northwest, which has very cheap power at about, I don't know, we pay 9 cents in our county. So it's well below the cost of service. And there's no way that these mini-grids of any kind can survive on that. They need to be charging 30 cents, 50 cents, sometimes $1 if it's a solar mini-grid. So that's an issue. So I've been talking about what mini-grids developers are kind of concerned about. Customers also need to have some comforts. They need to know that the mini-grid is safe and it's not going to electrocute their children. They need to know that the power is reliable and that it's not going to be too expensive. But effective regulation requires a regulator. As I mentioned, there's no regulatory authority now in Myanmar, and it's difficult for the country at this point to kind of find the political will to put in place an independent regulator. The ministry that does electrification is powerful and not at all interested in having somebody else be the referee and tell them what they can or can't do. So in the meanwhile, what are some things that can be done? One is to make sure that the geospatial maps that are made for electrification are up to date, and as things change and politics kind of pushes them around, that they reflect reality and reflect what the current planning is by the utility. Another is that licensing can either be done at the state level or by the DRD, the government office that I work with. And it can be, well, what we did in Tanzania was that we said that, okay, projects that are less than 10 megawatts have a streamlined licensing process that is less than what a large coal power plant or natural gas power plant or whatever would need to go through. And it would be just voluntary for projects that were below a certain size, below a megawatt in scale. And then there's this issue of what we call provisional licenses. This is the right to reserve a site so that nobody's going to come in and steal it and develop it out from under you. But typically, this needs to be done, subject to demonstrating progress on developing it. So you don't want people to just kind of gather a whole bunch of sites and sit on them, or gather a whole bunch and sit on them and try to sell the licenses. So by saying, okay, well, within 12 months you have to have your engineering done, and within 16 months have all of your permits and so forth. There needs to be an understanding that folks can charge whatever tariffs they need to in order to make a viable business. And there's simple spreadsheet models where you can put in the costs of building and operating the mini-grid, and then determine tariffs that a well-run company would be able to earn a reasonable return on investment. Quality of service standards, or even voluntary quality of service standards can be put in place so that if a mini-grid company claims to provide a certain level of service, they can be benchmarked against something that's actually written down, and procedures put in place to monitor whether they're actually selling electricity at the quality that they claim to. And then finally, there's this issue of options when the main grid arrives. How can this mini-grid not be kind of bulldozed out of the way and destroyed when the main grid arrives? And I'll touch a bit more on those. So here's the situation. Ooh. It's hard to go back, so I'm not going to bother. You had a mini-grid that was isolated initially, and National Grid was doing its own thing. And then at some point, the National Grid expands into the territory that the mini-grid had been providing service to. So one option is that they just kind of coexist. The mini-grid still sells electricity to some customers, maybe all customers. Some customers might have two connections, two sets of wires running to them. It's not super efficient because it's kind of a duplication of infrastructure. But often in the absence of a set of regulations, that can happen. What often will happen is just that the mini-grid gets abandoned. When the main grid comes in and it sells electricity cheap, the mini-grid can't afford to stay in business, and so they just pack up and leave. One option that we're seeing a huge amount in a nearby country, Cambodia, is these mini-grids becoming small power distributors. So they shut down the generation side of their business, and then they purchase electricity at wholesale from the national utility, but keep their own distribution lines and then sell that electricity at retail. And there's over 250 diesel mini-grids in Cambodia that have made this transition now to becoming small power distributors. Another option is being a small power producer. So the mini-grids generation assets generate electricity and sell back to the national grid. And this works particularly well for microhydro because hydro produces electricity 24 hours a day. And often, as a mini-grid, they weren't able to sell that electricity at 3 o'clock in the morning to a household because there's no need for it. But if you're selling to the national grid, you can sell all of it all the time. And then there's the option of both selling surplus electricity to the national grid, but also purchasing electricity when they need to from the national grid and reselling it. And this works well in situations where the mini-grid was sufficient initially to provide electricity for the village, but over time people started adding rice cookers and bigger TVs and so forth, and new people started moving to the village because there was electricity there, and at some point there just wasn't enough capacity from the mini-grid to be able to supply those loads, especially in the evening time when everybody had everything turned on at once. So an arrangement like this would allow electricity to be purchased and meet those loads in the evening time. And then finally, another option is what we would call the buyout option, where the utility would purchase the assets of the mini-grid and at a fair price that reflected both the depreciated value of that equipment, but also some of the money that was spent making the whole project happen. And for this option and some of the options, of course, other options, it's important that those mini-grid distribution systems are built to the utility standards so that they can accept that utility power and aren't so funky that it's not worthwhile. So these sets of options for what happens when the main grid arrives, at this point are for the Myanmar case, are conceptual. They've happened. They've happened in countries in East Africa. They've happened to a certain extent here in the United States with similar net metering policies and so forth. And in Myanmar, what we're looking to do in this year is kind of build an initial pilot. And this particular microhydro station in Shan State, by coincidence, happens to have both medium voltage and low voltage lines from the national utility, the electricity supply enterprise, that come within about 600 feet. And so it's a perfect opportunity to kind of pilot this with the utilities. So one of the things we're doing is talking with the utility to allow this to happen. And the funding and the engineering are all in place. It's just a matter of the utility agreeing. So that's what I've got for slides. A lot of this material is covered in a huge amount more detail in this book, From the Bottom Up, How Small Power Producers and Mini-Grids Can Deliver Electrification and Renewable Energy in Africa. I'll leave a copy with Joel, and it's also available from this URL for free download in English and French from the World Bank website. So with that, I think I'll stop, and if folks have any questions or any comments or thoughts, I'd love to hear them. Yeah.